Hello class, this is Dr. Branch. I trust you're doing well, and I hope you're looking forward to learning some more about economic theory. In this lecture, the basic goal is for you to distinguish between capitalism, Marxism, and socialism, a question worth 24 points on the midterm. So you want to make sure and listen closely, because this is not in either one of your textbooks, but I do expect you to know it on the midterm. So let me just use an example when we talk about economic theory of the story of Robinson Crusoe. Many of you read this story when you were in elementary school, the man who is washed ashore on a desolated island. And so he has several questions he has to decide very quickly after Robinson Crusoe is washed ashore. He has to decide, how is he going to spend his time? What is he going to do? What's the most important thing to do first? And then he needed to know what resources were available on the island. If you read the book, you know he brought some things from the ship, but he also had to discover what resources were available on the island. If you remember, he found some wild goats that he used. Should he build a shelter or should he build a fire? These are the sort of questions he had to ask. And if you think about it, these are all really economic questions, and the sort of questions that Robinson Crusoe was having to answer, especially in his first few days on the island, are very relevant to the issue of economics and the way different economic systems may answer those questions. And perhaps it'll give you some help in thinking about economic theory. So let me give you a couple of basic terms. That in secular colleges, there are entire semester-long courses dedicated to both macroeconomics and microeconomics. I'm just giving you a couple of definitions. Macroeconomics studies the behavior of the aggregate economy, and so it's looking at economy-wide phenomena. Macroeconomics is at the macro level, the largest level, so it's looking at things like gross domestic product and inflation and price levels, and we already talked about gross domestic product last week. But microeconomics, this actually is the branch of economics that analyzes the market behavior of individual consumers and firms in an attempt to understand the decision-making process of firms and households. So it's really more about why an individual consumer makes the choices he or she does when purchasing a product, or choosing not to purchase a product, or saving money, or choosing not to save money, and these sort of things. There will be a couple of questions on the midterm where you just need to know the difference between macroeconomics and microeconomics, and I'm going to scoot on from that. Now, I'm just going to say a quick word about the branches of the United States government and the agencies related to economics. I have several listed here, but I'm going to scoot to a slide that is a diagram showing the budget process. And as we discuss and we debate economics in this class, many of the questions, as we noted in the last lecture, are really about how the federal government is going to spend money. And the federal budget process is a bit more complicated than most people realize. This diagram here, I'm not going to go through it all, but you can look at it on your own later. But it gives you an idea of all the different moving parts that have to work together for the federal budget to actually reach completion, and that gives you some idea of the different points where you can have debate and political arguments at each point in this process, which is where a lot of our economic debates occur at in our country, is at different points in this process. And I just wanted you to be aware of that and the complexity associated with it. There is not a question on the midterm about the federal budget process. Now, before I move on to the three basic economic theories of capitalism, Marxism, and socialism, I want to remind you that no system of economics is perfect. This is a very poignant picture taken by photographer Dorothea Lange during the Great Depression, and it's a depiction of some destitute pea pickers in California taken in March 1936. This lady, as she told Dorothea Lange, we don't know her name, but this lady was 32 years old at the time. She looks much older. She told Dorothea that she and her children had been surviving by eating frozen peas that they had gotten from the fields over the night, and the birds that her children were catching, and she had just sold the tires off her old car to purchase food. This is another picture of the squalid camp in which she was living. What I'm saying is this poignant scene from the Great Depression reminds us all the very real tragedy associated with economic problems. And as we try to solve those problems, we want to remember no system of economics is perfect. I'm going to begin with the system of capitalism, and I think it's fair for me to share my bias. I am in favor of some form of free market capitalism. Doesn't mean I agree with everything in capitalism, but it seems that some form of free market capitalism is the best option out there. So let me give a definition. Capitalism is an economic system under which the ownership of goods and services are privately owned, stress privately owned there, and decisions concerning pricing, investments, and distribution are determined in a free market system. Basically, the market itself determines prices, primarily on the basis of competition between businesses and not primarily through central planning. Now, the United States has toyed with market system, price regulation in the past. During the Nixon administration, this was tried, did not work out too well. So the United States has toyed with these things before. A lot of our farm subsidies are actually ways of guaranteeing a certain price for different things. But basically, by and large, America has a free market system where the market determines the price of the goods that you purchase. And it's a system where supply and demand determine prices, and you're going to learn about that in the first couple of chapters of your basic economics book. Now, when you think of capitalism, this photograph should be an image you might think of, and that's the New York Stock Exchange, perhaps a worldwide symbol of capitalism, and that's just a way for you to think about it and remember it. So let me give you some foundation stones of capitalism. First is the right of people to own their private property, and the right to earn a profit on goods and services, provided that if you provide a good that someone needs, that you have a right to earn a profit when you sell it to that person. An emphasis on prudent risk-taking. That adjective prudent is added by me specifically, that you don't want to be foolish, but prudent risk-taking. And entrepreneurial skills, the ability to strike out on one's own and try something new. The freedom to make choices based on one's own preferences. This is where the consumer comes in. I am free to buy a Mac. I am free to buy a PC. It's based on my own preference. I don't have someone telling me which one I have to have. And that also business thrives when people have a personal interest in their work. If there's an opportunity for me to get ahead and earn more money, I am more personally invested in my work, and I'm going to do a better job. And so it's incentives, and incentives matter, and it helps. And when people have incentives to do a better job, then everyone benefits. Those are some foundation stones of capitalism. Capitalism and a free market or a market economy are they go hand in hand. And it's an economic system, again, in which decisions in the pricing of goods and services are guided solely by the aggregate interactions of a country's citizens and business. Now, what that means is the government doesn't set the price for milk, for example, or grain, or things like that in a pure free market economy. As I said, the United States is a majority free market economy, but many of our farm subsidies, in fact, work to set the prices of certain goods that we receive, particularly agricultural goods. This also happens to a degree in some of the industries that provide us power and also provide us heat and gas and these sort of things. Public services, to a certain degree, are overseen by the government, but basically we have a free market economy. This is opposite of a centrally planned economy, and this is perhaps one of the central differences between both Marxism and socialism and capitalism is Marxism and socialism tend to be centrally planned. One form of capitalism which is bad is called crony capitalism. That is a description of a capitalist society based on close relationships between businessmen and the state. People have sort of an inside track that other people don't have, and therefore they have an unfair advantage. And this can be a weakness in a free market economy. But instead of success being determined by a free market and rule of law, it's dependent on favoritism. Who do you know? How much money have you given? So this idea of crony capitalism comes up a lot. when there are discussions about campaign contributions, how much money should people give to particular campaigns, and the idea is that if you give a lot of money, you're basically buying access to the halls of power. Let me say a word about laissez-faire economics. This is probably a term I'm assuming you know, probably picked up in sociology in high school or something like that. But here's what I would say. It's a French phrase that basically means let do, and it describes an economic system where business failure is determined from a course of events as they naturally occur without any government intervention. So what emerged out of the Great Depression, think back to the picture of the lady, the pea picker in California I showed you a few moments ago, is basically our social welfare system here in the United States is an attempt to rein in some of the nastier edges of laissez-faire economics. So let's talk about some strengths of capitalism, and I think there's several that are quite compelling to me. First, achievement and hard work is rewarded. If you work hard, you come up with a better idea. In most cases, that's going to be rewarded. And when someone is rewarded for hard work and achievement, the idea is also the rest of us get a better product or we get a better service, and so everyone benefits, which means it is the best for consumers. These two go hand in hand. Someone achieves a new idea. For example, the Steve Jobs and these wonderful personal computers that we all use today, they came up with better ideas back in the 1970s. They made a lot of money, but all the rest of us benefit. You're taking a class online instead of having to drive to Kansas City because of things that were achieved by these pioneers in the computer industry back in the 70s, especially with home computers. So these two go hand in hand. It's the most consistent with Scripture. Now, I'm going to argue this later on in the semester. I'm just going to say it here and move on. But if you'll allow me just to say it here without defending it, but later on in the semester, I'm going to try to make that case. The zero-sum myth. Now, this will be on the midterm. This is a critique of capitalism, which I think is not true. And here's what the myth says, that in a free market, someone has to win, someone gets richer, and someone else has to lose, someone else gets poor. This is President Obama, frankly, advocates things like this, that a free market is bad. Someone always has to lose. Well, this is simply a myth. In a free market economy, in a best case scenario, everyone wins. The standard of living and wealth increases for the entire population. An old cliche says a rising tide raises all ships, and that's exactly what happens. If you will think back to our last lecture when I talked about poverty in America being different from poverty in the rest of the world, the reason that's so is because of our free market economy. So this does not deny that some people will have more wealth than others. There are, where I live at, about a mile away from me, is a fabulously wealthy subdivision full of beautiful homes. It's called Briarcliff, and the folks that live there are more wealthy than me. I'm not envious of them. I celebrate their success in life. But it doesn't necessarily mean that those people living in Briarcliff became wealthy at my expense. In fact, many of them, my daughter had a friend whose mother lived over there, mother and father lived there in Briarcliff. They were both physicians from India. They worked hard, came to the United States, immigrated here, went to med school here in the United States, became fabulously successful because they're good at what they do, and I benefit when I need health care because of their success. So the zero-sum myth is just that. It is a myth. And that's going to be on the midterm, and this is one of the major, I cannot stress, this myth comes up all the time in public debates, and I find it quite frustrating. So here's what else I would say. Voluntary exchanges benefit both parties. A free market maximizes the opportunity for growth and social mobility. Let me give you an example. My grandparents were cotton farmers in Clay County, Alabama in the 1930s and 40s, and my grandfather moved into the lumber business. But my dad plowed with a mule on a farm in rural Clay County where they did not have indoor plumbing and they did not have electricity. And yet today, all of his kids have moved forward socially. That only happens in a free market economy. If you don't get that, what you have is a socialist economy wanting to stick us all in some apartment complex on the outside of a city where we're all leveled at a certain level of poverty. So very, very adamant that capitalism gives people the chance for social mobility. I feel that in my own life. So, other thing I would say is poor people willingly immigrate to free countries. If you notice, if you give people a chance and you said, okay, you're a poor person living in Syria suffering under ISIS, you've got an opportunity. Do you want to go to Greece or do you want to go to the United States? They're going to choose the United States almost every time. Why? It's because Greece's socialist economy is bankrupt, and we're not quite bankrupt yet, but because we have a free market economy. So in a free market, one sees income growth across all categories, and this is what I was saying. When one person succeeds, it actually increases wealth for others. And the last thing I would say is that capitalism actually promotes individual liberty and freedom. These are wonderful things for all people. So I cannot stress enough that capitalism is closely tied with free countries and countries that are Marxist, things like religious liberty, things like personal liberties. You just don't see those in Marxist economies. You see them, they're associated more frequently with capitalist economies. So there are some, weaknesses. First, inequality does occur, sometimes at extreme levels. There are occasions when monopolies occur. This is an ongoing problem here in the United States. We've wrestled with it for 150 years. But what happens when certain groups of people have the power to a certain resource that everyone needs, and they are growing extremely wealthy because they have a monopoly? And then there are times when capitalism can contribute to environmental destruction. I have in mind here something like the hydraulic minings of the 1800s, which is a bad deal, and which we no longer do, thankfully. So those are some weaknesses. Now, I'm going to say a couple of quick things about communism. First of all, communism defined is an economic system under which a single authoritarian party controls the means of production. Under a communist regime, there is no private property and goods are available to all and distributed equally, hypothetically. Now that's theoretically, it never happens that way. They always have an upper class. The people that run the economy, that run the government, are always wealthier than everyone else, so this is actually a pipe dream. It's a command economy in which government decides what or will not be produced, which leads to lots of problems. It never increases the quality of goods received by people. Founder, of course, Karl Marx. It's actually a history of theory, and it proposes an ongoing class warfare, and this is where I believe our current administration, I'm speaking now in 2016, President Obama's administration, a lot of class warfare language, which he has borrowed from Marxism. Someone has asked me if I thought President Obama was a Marxist. I don't think he's a pure Marxist, but he's a thinker who's been strongly influenced by Marxist thoughts. But in many ways, their goal is a utopia where each from his ability, to each according to his need. And really it's a perversion of the Christian eschatology, the idea of the millennium. And so they're trying to usher in sort of a humanist millennium. And they're attempting to do this from an atheistic and evolutionary worldview. I'm going to scoot past this part and let me talk about several weaknesses of communism and some problems I have. First of all, this idea of class conflict. It does not promote peace between people. It promotes antagonism between people. You have to be jealous of someone else because they've succeeded. Also, this idea of the particular stages of society, which society is just determined to go through, is not always true. But I want to focus on the third one, opposition to religion in general and Christianity in particular. And this is where some of my concern about Marxist thinking has bled over into the United States, particularly in court decisions which striking at religious freedom here in recent years. And communism is, as opposed to God and freedom of religion, in fact sees religion, Christianity, and Judaism in particular are seen as foundation stones to capitalism. So one way to get rid of capitalism is to get rid of Christianity and Judaism, the two major monotheistic religions besides Islam. So here's what Marx said. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and it is the spirit of spiritless conditions. Here's the famous statement, it is the opium of the people. And what Marx meant by that is the wealthy owners of production just use religion as sort of an opium to keep people so stoned, if you will, in their thinking that they don't realize how oppressed they are. And so one way for people to realize that they are oppressed is to get rid of religion. That's a Marxist thought. Opposition to the traditional family. I can't stress this enough. Marx was violently opposed to the traditional family, and in Marxist theory, the traditional family, the nuclear family, a mother, a father, and children raised in a home, is seen as foundational to capitalism. Therefore, in addition to opposing religion, you've got to fight the traditional family. This, in my opinion, a lot of the things we've seen since the sexual revolution, the social reengineering that's going on, is really striking at the traditional family. And at least for some of the thinkers, the goal at striking at the traditional family is actually a step towards Marxism. I'm not trying to get into conspiracy theories. That's not my goal here. I'm just saying that's the trajectory some of these folks are operating from. And also there's a sense of utilitarian ethics. The ends justifies the means. The means is this ultimate utopia where everyone lives in peace and harmony, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, and anything that you do to achieve that goal is okay. And the central term, I want you to remember this, in communism is revolution. The revolution has to occur to overturn the existing society. And when you hear a communist talk about revolution, what they mean is several million innocent people are going to die. But it's okay because our goal is so noble and so good. And again, this is tied closely to their false idea of a secular utopia. This is one of my favorite little things I've picked up. Communism. If we kill everyone who is unhappy, we can make paradise. And I say that's probably right. This is a picture of the killing fields in Cambodia. I want you to remember the killing fields were all about a communist revolution. And when you think of all those skulls of those poor people that were killed by the Khmer Rouge, don't forget, a nation that becomes communist, in that process, will see millions of innocent people die. So we've already talked about several of these things, but let me point out one more. The Bible stresses you have a right to own private property, and which is devastating. If that's true, you're never really going to have a Marxist theory that works well with the Bible. Let me say a word about socialism. Socialism is almost halfway between Marxism and capitalism. It's an attempt to have a very involved government without all the nasty edges of Marxism, but still giving people some freedom. It's an economic system under which the government owns and administrates the means of production, or at least the major means of production and distribution of goods. Goods and wages are distributed unequally on the basis of the work performed. It's viewed as being, again, this somewhere in between capitalism and communism. Typically in a socialist country, for example, the government won't own all the businesses, but they may own the major ones. For example, oil production, or maybe if it's a particular country, wheat production is owned by the government. Things like that. So differences with communism, and it basically allows for limited private property ownership. There are some allowance for two parties in politics, and you never get two parties in a Marxist state. So purported strengths, they're going to claim that wealth is distributed more evenly. Of course, the problem being if you have socialism, you're ultimately going to limit the ability to earn wealth. They're going to claim they're more environmentally friendly. That's why I say hug a tree. They're going to claim they're not as prone to cycles of recession. And so the trade-off with socialism, they're going to tell you is, okay, in a free market economy, you might get really rich, but every now and then you're going to see something like the Great Depression. But in a socialistic economy, you may never get as wealthy as Bill Gates or someone like that, but you know what? You're never going to experience something like the Great Depression, which is tied to their claim that you're going to see less poverty. So those are purported strengths. Here's some weaknesses. First of all, success is punished in socialism. If you're really good at what you do, you're going to get taxed at a higher rate, and so you're punished for being successful. And in that way, it does not encourage people to come up with new ideas and to be entrepreneurial. Which is closely related to this. Therefore, there is no incentive to succeed, and therefore the consumer suffers because the producer is not motivated to succeed, which means we don't get new and better products as frequently. Third thing I would say is governments are not omniscient, and they can't plan very well. There are fewer technological advances typically, And then you have massive debt. I use Greece as an example, and I would just say the United States has a large socialistic component to the way our government's been running, and this is leading to our national debt. I'll just go ahead and tell you, my great concern for the United States right now is the national debt at $19 trillion. That all has to be paid back at some point. And I fear, I hope I'm wrong, but I fear that we're somewhere on a trajectory to look just like Greece, where the government's just going to go bankrupt at some point. We'll talk more about that during the semester. Democratic socialism, while influential in Europe, has lost ground in recent years. I would point you to the election of Margaret Thatcher in Great Britain, which was basically Great Britain's way of saying, yes, socialism has not been working out well after World War II. Communism in Russia collapsed in 1990. That's still very alive in places like Venezuela and Cuba. China is undergoing a shift to a market economy, but it's still got a communist government. It's really an odd experiment and the question is, how long can China continue on this path? Dr. Branch strongly believes that some form of free market capitalism is most consistent with biblical ethics. This does not mean that every capitalist idea is good or should be embraced. Well, that gives you some basic ideas about the three major theories that are out there. I hope this is helpful. There will be a question on the midterm where you differentiate between communism, capitalism, and socialism.